All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to a live question and answer session with Rabbi Levi Shmotkin, the author of the book Letters. Remind me the title of the book.
Letters for Life.
Letters for Life. Thank you very much. My name is Eliezer Zalmanov. I'm the director of Chabad of Northwest Indiana in a town called Munster. I'm joined by Rabbi Levi Shmotkin, the author of Letters for Life, which is a compilation of letters in book format, sharing with the world the Rebbe's teachings. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the leader of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, communicated with hundreds of people, thousands of people over a period of close to 50 years, even before he was officially the Rebbe of the Chabad movement, when he was still the son-in-law of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And over the years, his writings evolved in many different ways, reaching many different parts of the universe. The Rebbe communicated with scholars, the Rebbe communicated with lay people, the Rebbe communicated with government officials, men, women, children. The Rebbe, of course, communicated with individuals, but also with communities as a whole. Many of these letters were eventually published in a set of books and continues to be published in a set called Igros Kodesh, literally meaning holy letters. The Rebbe's writing spanned all areas of intellectualism, religion, as well as emotional health. When the Rebbe would write to someone on an individual basis, the Rebbe would be addressing that individual. The Rebbe would be speaking about that person's challenges. And when it came to emotional health, it was almost discernible that the Rebbe was talking to that person directly. So Rabbi Levi Shmotkin took it upon himself, and we'll hear more from him directly in a few minutes. Rabbi Levi Shmotkin took it upon himself to distill and to bring the teachings of the Rebbe, specifically in the field of emotional health, from these letters that the Rebbe wrote over 50 years to the masses, to the world, for everybody to be able to appreciate it and to relate to it. Now, as I said earlier, I'm Eliezer Zalmanov. Some of you might know me from the Ask the Rabbi team on Chabad.org or from the comments section on the website of Chabad.org. What we're going to try to do today for the next hour or so is gain an appreciation for the work that Rabbi Shmotkin put into this book. But more than just hear his story, since this is a new venture for us, a live question and answer session on the internet and coming at you literally live. I'm in Munster, he's in Brooklyn. Bear with us as we navigate these new territories, these new waters, and try to, like I said, distill and understand and break down in very simple and relatable terms how the Rebbe's words, which were written to individuals over the years, can actually relate to us today in the year 2025 and beyond. Because as the Talmud teaches us, when a tzaddik, when a righteous person says something and shares a teaching, it's eternal and it has an application wherever we are and wherever we go and in all parts of life. So we'll start with a couple of softball questions to Rabbi Shmotkin. In terms of how he got into writing such a book. Obviously, a large part of the letters in the book are focused on emotional health. So what drew you to that? What drew you to attempt to find the Rebbe's advice and guidance in this specific discipline? I guess more in general terms, what led you to write a book like this?
Okay, it's an excellent question. I never thought I would be an author. It wasn't on my agenda. I would say, an ordinary traditional yeshiva student, going through the strokes of studying the Talmud, studying the Hasidic masters. And, as I'm growing into a person of my own and my own mind and heart started emerging, I'm in the study hall trying to study. And this inner world starts gnawing at me. I'm studying the Tosfos, I'm studying the Talmudic sages, and heavier feelings, heavier thoughts that I think is universal for most young adults, started drawing my attention away from whatever academic pursuits I was having and pulling at me to be addressed in a personal way, in a way that talks to the actual human experience that we have. That's when I found myself gravitating to an immense body of literature that I was actually on the shelves of the yeshiva that I was studying in, but I actually never spent time to look into it and really understand it. And that is the set you mentioned, Igrot Kodesh, the Rebbe's extensive private counseling. And we're dealing with a set that contains to date over 13,000 letters. So it's an immense amount of studying. And there I was, have this inner world that I'm looking to address. And I start opening these letters. And I find letters from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 70s, where the Rebbe is addressing young people, I would say in the same or similar situation, despite being decades apart, as I was in, facing the insecurities, the fears, the questions that come with finding your own path in the world that we all know is quite unsettling today. So there I am, I'm reading one letter, another letter, and the Rebbe is addressing, based on 3,000 years of Jewish wisdom, based on all the things I was studying in yeshiva for many years before, but I never saw the link between that and the lived experience of emotions and thoughts. And I'm reading one letter, another letter, and slowly I start seeing patterns emerging. These recurring ideas that the Rebbe sees as pillars for building the emotional stability that we all want. So I started taking down notes just for myself. Here's one idea that the Rebbe is counseling based on the Torah. Here's another idea. Here's another idea. Here's one letter. Here's a letter from the 70s. Here's a letter to a mother. Here's a letter to someone middle-aged. Here's a letter to someone in a senior home. Here's a letter to a child. Here's a letter that packages it in practical terms. Here's a letter that packages it in conceptual terms. And my notebook started growing. And when I felt that I had some grip of some of these recurring ideas, I started to try to implement them in my life. Some of them are more cognitive ideas, about changing perspective, shifting the entire way you view yourself or you view life. Some of them are mental. It's about how to respond to negative thoughts when they emerge. Some of them are behavioral, simply changing your routine, improving your schedule. And day in, day out, I'm trying to work through these ideas that I have in my notebook in my personal life. And slowly, no emotional change happens overnight, but slowly I started feeling a transformative energy that was lifting me from the darker place that I was in and opening up a new way to see myself, to see the world, to see other people. And I had a very strong sense of gratitude to these letters, to the Hasidic wisdom that the Rebbe distilled in them, and to the Rebbe for gifting me these tools that I didn't understand before, and I now was able to integrate in my life. And that sense of gratitude propelled me to try to share these ideas with other people. I did not realize, what that entails. I thought I would put into a book for the English reader. Took a little longer than I expected, but thank God that emerged in Letters for Life. So that's kind of the backstory of how this project emerged.
So I'm actually going to jump into a question we got online before the live broadcast started, which kind of feeds right into what you were just discussing. Because you're talking about how you started reading the letters from the Rebbe just as anyone else would be reading them. And over time, it developed an appreciation for the pattern, for the style. But this question we got from Sylvia in the UK, who asked if being able to relate the teachings that we got from the Rebbe, that you're reading in these letters from the Rebbe, does that require to have an actual relationship with the Rebbe, having either known the Rebbe personally during his lifetime or being raised or growing up in a family that is within the Chabad community where your parents knew the Rebbe, your grandparents knew the Rebbe, or is it something that anybody can just open up and glean inspiration, guidance from the letters of the Rebbe?
So I think what I keep finding, especially after the book came out and I get to hear from different people in different parts of the world, how they resonated with it, the essence of the emotional experience is universal. The way it manifests changes over time, changes by place. Today we have new technologies that fuel a lot of the anxiety. But when you strip down to the bottom of the human experience, it's the same across time and across place. So what I keep finding is that because the Rebbe's ideas emerge from the Torah, which is timeless and eternal, it also addresses people in whatever state and whatever background they have, whether they have a background in Hasidic teachings, whether they don't. It's pierces through the outside layers and touches the place where we're all have the same experience. So I would say it applies to all, no matter the background.
So once you started collecting letters and jotting down notes and putting this project together, how long did it take you to actually end up with a full book and uh, and something that you're proud to put your name on?
It took 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, if not for COVID, it probably would have taken a little longer. It had those years to actually immerse. Once I decided to try to put into a book, my first understanding was I need to really master the material. So I went back to the research, doubled down, try to really know the letters, and then started the writing process, the revision process, and until the publication. So it was about 5 years.
Okay, let's talk about the reception so far. You published a book, obviously within the Chabad community, it was a hit, and you've been traveling around the world promoting the book and talking about it and talking about the Rebbe's letters and the Rebbe's private counsel. How's that been?
It's actually very special because I know, and I'm sure if anyone listening dabbles in writing, when you write, there's always the strong voice of self-doubt. Nobody reads today, nobody cares today, you're wasting your time. We're well beyond books. And your only hope is that maybe it'll touch one person, it'll touch two people. So over the last few months, to be able to hear and see from people around the world how the Rebbe's ideas are resonating has been extraordinary. And these are Jews, non-Jews. I was in Sydney talking at a high school there called Moriah College, and the security guard is not Jewish. He's actually a pastor. And the person who invited me in told the security guard that he's waiting for someone named so-and-so who wrote Letters for Life. So the pastor is like the security guard, which is the pastor on the side, said, that's so interesting because I was just counseling a couple and they told me I need to read Letters for Life. So to be on the other side of the world and to see how, across denominations, people are resonating with these ideas from the Rebbe, again, I think talks to the point I said before. It's timeless, it's universal, and it touches to the essence of the human experience. So it's been very special.
So Sydney's obviously on the other side of the world. How many locations, how many cities have you been to so far since the publication of the book?
I think it's about 100. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And do you usually speak about the book? Do you answer questions? Do people ask you very pointed questions about things that you've written about, or are people just more curious about the Rebbe in general?
A little bit of everything. I think what drives people the most is people are looking for deeper wisdom in their life. So people will ask a question, even if they couch it in more broader terms. I found that every question has a backstory, and people are asking mainly about things that are happening to them in their personal life. So someone will ask a general question about grief. What does the Rebbe say when you lose a loved one? And of course, when you speak to them later one-on-one, you understand that they've just lost a brother, they've just lost a mother. People ask questions about parenting, and you speak to them later, they have a teenager who they're grappling with. They're not sure how much distance, how much involvement they should have. So yeah, there's always a background to the question. And then I think what I keep seeing in the questions, people are asking, they want something that touches them in their life. How does this apply to me?
Back to the actual writing process. As you're studying the letters from the Rebbe, and there's nearly 30 volumes of Vigorous Kodesh, did you find any surprises, anything unexpected, anything that maybe is even counterintuitive, something maybe that goes against conventional wisdom, where you expect the Rebbe to say one thing, or you expect Torah or Judaism to say one thing, and suddenly you're blown away by the Rebbe's approach to certain issues?
So there are many. There's one example that comes to mind right now, and that is it's a response to a young woman who wrote to the Rebbe about her newly found fear of flying. She developed this fear of getting on a plane, and she's now incapable of traveling the type of travel that needs a plane. And it's clear from the way the Rebbe responds to her that she was very scared about what this means, the implications this has for the continuation of her life. She'll never be able to fly, she'll never be able to travel, what's going to be with her. So she's roiled up in fear and angst and in trepidation about her life and her future. And she writes this letter to the Rebbe talking about her newfound fear and seeking advice. And the Rebbe tells her something very interesting. He says, I want you to try to think a little bit less about your fear, to try to divert your mind from the presence of this struggle and angst that you have about flying. But a tip that I have for you for doing that is to actually think about the fact that travel is not critical for a human being. There are millions of people today, the Rebbe writes, and many, many more, of course, in previous generations, who live amazing lives, happy lives, content lives, without traveling very far. And it's not because they can't, it's because they don't feel the need. They have pleasure, they set up life, and they're happy. And then the Rebbe had something interesting. He says, think about Shabbat and festivals. Those are days that, according to the Torah, are the times you want to have maximum pleasure. It's a mitzvah to have pleasure. And nevertheless, in those days, not only is it not a mandate to travel, you're actually prohibited to travel. According to the Torah, we can't get into a car, we can't get into a plane on Shabbos. So what does that show me? That showed me I can live not only a decent life, but actually a life of pleasure and the ultimate pleasure, and nevertheless not need to travel. Now, what the Rebbe is doing here, and it's very clear in the response, he's not telling her your problem is not a problem. No, the goal of this response is to get you back on a plane. We want to get you back on planes. We want to get you back traveling. Of course, it adds to life. It gives pleasure. It's important. However, the best way to get you back on planes is actually for you to realize that it's not critical, to make peace with the fact that in the worst case that you continue with this fear and you're not able to fly, you'll still be able to live a life, and you'll still be able to life that includes some pleasure. And when you raise that weight that you've been having in that entanglement with the flying, that will actually counterintuitively, paradoxically help you get back on the plane. And that talks the broader idea that you keep seeing in the Rebbe's counseling that, and this phrase is mine, so take it in with a grain of salt, but that 75% of problems are not the problem itself, but it's our angst about the problem. It's our worry about the worry. It's our fear about the fear. And that entanglement not only makes it so much more difficult for us, it actually fuels the problem. And when we're able to lift that weight, whether by introducing Hashem and his help to us, whether by understanding that worst case and the problem persists, we'll still be good people, we'll still be able to live a life. Whatever the different methods the Rebbe used for that, that itself goes a long way in healing not only us, but actually healing the problem, because that weight and pressure is what actually gives life to it in a very interesting way. So that's one example of a counterintuitive letter that really struck me as very interesting.
And that's fascinating, because all it takes is one letter in the entire set of Igros Kodesh, for example, to touch on that, and that gives you insight to something that everybody can relate to. And the reason I'm speaking about this specifically is because when I was a child, I had a fear of flying. And I grew up at a point where the Rebbe was no longer responding to people's letters at length. Over the years, as the Chabad community grew, and by extension, people that were familiar with the Rebbe and aware of the Rebbe grew, people were sending hundreds of letters to the Rebbe, and the mailman who delivered mail to 770 to the Rebbe's address was known to have said that this is the most mail in the entire Brooklyn at some point. So the Rebbe just physically wasn't able to respond to all letters that were sent to him. And very often it was just a one-word answer, a quote, which was very famous within the Chabad community, Asker ala Tzion, which means the Rebbe says, I received your letter, basically, and I will pray for you next time I visit the grave of my father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. So as a child, my family was traveling to Israel, and I had a fear of flying. I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and my mother said, why don't you write a letter to the Rebbe and explain your fear? So I did that. I sat down at pen and paper and wrote a letter to the Rebbe. And a few days later, the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Klein, called my mother and said, the Rebbe responded, Asker ala Tzion. And I was like, I was hoping for an actual answer, a letter of encouragement where the Rebbe says, it's okay, it'll be fine. But my parents explained to me that when the Rebbe prays for you, and when the Rebbe mentions your name among hundreds of others and thousands of others at the grave of his father-in-law, that's the greatest blessing. That's the greatest encouragement you can get. And it's also perhaps the Rebbe's way of saying, I already addressed this subject to someone else. Eventually, the letters were published, and you can find all the answers everywhere. We have some questions that are coming in online. One question that just jumps up because it's extremely time relevant, and that is, what would the Rebbe have said about AI, artificial intelligence today. Obviously, AI is a relatively new phenomenon, and technology has evolved over generations. What would the Rebbe have said about that?
So I think there's a few points to keep in mind when we discuss something as vast as AI. So there's an interesting letter in the endnotes of the book where a woman writes to the Rebbe about her fear that the world is going to go up in nuclear fire. It's a matter of time, and we're going to nuke each other, and the world will end. This is in the 60s when the Cold War was at its height. And what the Rebbe writes to her is that if you looking back in history, you see at every phase, people were scared that the end of humanity is near. It says there's gunpowder. When gunpowder emerged, people were like, yeah, this is the end. We can kill each other at volumes that were never possible. And the Rebbe says when the plane bomber emerged, that people also had that fear. That's it. We can bomb each other to death. And nevertheless, the world stands. And I think that's a general perspective that leans on an element of faith in Hashem. That yes, there are dangers. Yes, we have to take them head on. Yes, we have to address what we can. But the existential fear that the whole world would go up in flames is something that I think the letters and their spirit can help address, even indirectly, because they shape our general perspective on life and on the world, that there's a general destiny, there's a general plan, there's a place that we have in this cosmic plan, and there's a general direction where we're all contributing to that with our individual life, but also as a collective. And when you have that in the background of your approach to life, big existential threats of apocalyptic predictions are a little less, unsettling in the macro. In terms of the specifics of how to deal with AI, it was very interesting. There's a character that emerges in the book. His name is Rabbi Shmotkin. He was a poet, one of the fathers of modern Hebrew, and he interacted with the Rebbe about his life and about his emotional state. So, as it goes with people in the book, I tried to also research some of his life story, some of his background, some of what he did as a person. And I came across an interview that he had in the 1960s with the Israeli television. And the interviewer asked Avram Shmotkin, she said, we see with computing that there's a new power for writing, a new power for translating. Are you worried? Are you worried that your job will go extinct, that your role as a prolific translator, he translated Shakespeare into Hebrew, will go extinct? I'm watching this now. I'm like, wow, if they were worried then,
Right.
What will be today? And he said something very insightful that I think talks also to general AI and to the specifics of perhaps the Rebbe's approach to it. And that is, he said, no, he's not worried. Why is he not worried? Because the whole method that computers work by is by statistical mathematics. And they're predicting what the next letter makes the most sense to be, what the next word makes the most sense to be. And he said, by definition, that creates a writing and a translating that is going to be conforming to whatever the norms are. It's going to be going by what makes the most sense based on quantity of what's out there. They said the power of writing and the power of a human being is to choose what's different, to choose a different word, an unexpected word, to talk to something that gets by what's, all the information that's inundating us, and actually talk to the soul, talk to the neshama, talk to something that's actually human. And therefore, he said, being that that's what I see as the role of the writer in the first place, not only am I not scared, I'm not worried at all about computing taking that over, because it's going in the opposite direction. And I think that talks to both sides of what the Rebbe saw in technology in general, and that is, it's a tool. It's a tool that is within context of us human beings and our role in this world. And it will never replace us. It will never be something that can do more than us, because what's most important in us is our spiritual life, our neshama, our soul, our connection to Hashem, our connection to God. And in that realm, the computer doesn't, and even artificial intelligence doesn't begin. However, we as human beings can utilize the power of technology and all the efficiency it brings to take that neshama, to take that soul and get it to reach more people, get it to reach ourselves in a new way, to be much more efficient in our role as human beings, but never is there a concern that it will replace human beings. So I think very positive tool, as long as it's understood as a tool and used in that type of way.
And also with tremendous lessons, connectivity, everybody always connected to one source, and everything coming together at the bottom of it all. We're getting many questions in on the live feed over here. So apologies in advance to our listeners and our viewers if we don't actually get to all the questions, but we're going to try to go through a few of these as the we have the next 35 minutes or so. One goes back to your writing process and your research process, really. How did you choose which letters to include in your book of Letters for Life, and which, obviously 30 volumes or so of Igros Kodesh, you have to discriminate what goes in and what doesn't.
Oh yeah, it was a very brutal process. That's part of why it took so long. It wasn't about deciding how we can fill the pages, actually trying to decide what we can take off to keep it compact. Ultimately, what decided was, I think, a mix of two factors. First of all, if I was able to find the backstory of the letter, which gives it the human narrative of the before and after. And second of all, the letters that are most elaborate in terms of explaining the principle that, I felt was the easiest to understand, or the most explicit. The Talmud says, the Torah's words are sometimes poor in one place and rich in another place, and they complement each other. So I tried to choose ones that I felt are more elaborate.
On that note, after the book was published, did you learn anything about some of the letters that were written and published? When someone reads the book and says, "Hey, here's a little bit more context behind the letter that you published," and maybe you would have platformed it differently.
I don't know if I would platform it differently, but actually, as a response to this Q&A, a woman reached out and said that she was reading the book in the extensive endnotes, and somewhere in there, she found a letter to her mother. It was written about her and her marriage. Actually, a very complex story that she explained to me. I don't want to get into details because of the specifics, but one point that I think is universal from that letter that I want to share is the Rebbe writing to her. It's connected to abortion. Part of the letter is connected to abortion, that her mother wanted her to abort her first child. And one of the points the Rebbe writes to her, and she gave me some of the backstory there, is that we also need to think about the traumatic effect, the lasting effect that a mother, especially her first child, and for whom who views children as the greatest blessings. And she told me this is where her and her mother had a different view of life, and her mother didn't understand. Her mother had a great career as a judge, but her mother didn't understand that from her perspective as a human being, her greatest gift that she can bring into the world is a new life. So from her mother, said this is getting in the way for various reasons. She felt the priority was to abort. And the Rebbe, she said, this is a letter from the 1980s. The Rebbe wrote a letter to her mother explaining to her mother why the Rebbe felt that recommending her daughter to abort would not only not help her, would actually put her in a traumatic episode that she would have a very difficult time recovering from. And she told me this is the words she told me. She said, if I would have listened to my mother, I probably would have committed suicide. And she said she's forever grateful to the Rebbe for taking the time. And the Rebbe writes in the beginning of the letter, it's in the endnotes, that I am writing this letter in haste, considering how important this is. And that is, I'm writing it on the eve of Purim, the day before Purim, and I'm sending it with a personal messenger. She told me that the Rebbe sent a personal messenger to deliver this letter to her mother, to explain to her that she should stop pressuring her daughter, considering everything that her daughter views about having this child. So that was just a very recent story of context that I received that gave a whole new light to the letter that I've studied and seen before. There are many other letters, but...
Right. Speaking of the endnotes in the book, readers, casual readers, are often turned off or put off by hundreds of pages of bibliography and glossary and all sorts of endnotes at the end of a book. but this book is obviously not a scholarly work per se. It's meant to be a book of self-help and guidance, personal guidance. So how's the reader expected to approach the end notes, because there's lots of them?
Yeah, so a little of the backstory of the end notes actually goes back to your question of how I decided to choose, was when I found these just extraordinary letters that touched me and I felt would touch so many other people. And I knew, considering the structure of the chapter and wanting to keep it tight and every word adding something and not to be repetitious, that it wouldn't work in the chapter. But I'm looking at this letter and like, I can't, this got to go in the book. So I just put it in the end notes. And that's how the end notes kind of grew. Just letter after letter, gem after gem that I say, it's got to go in the book somewhere. So I put it in the end notes. That's one point of how the end notes grew into what they are. But another point, and I think this is really important and maybe interesting, is that I wanted to keep the actual structure of the chapters to be, as relatable, personable, and, on the level of human experience and less scholarly. However, there is a very fascinating realm of the Rebbe's counseling that I wanted to give the interested reader the ability to delve into, and that is the way the Rebbe takes his counseling ideas from the 3,000 years of Jewish scholarship and the development of the Torah. And whenever I found a letter where the Rebbe did reveal or show his sources in the Torah, I wanted to elaborate on that in the endnotes so the reader can see that. And I'll give one example, and that is the idea that I think those who've read the Rebbe's letters would recognize of trach good v'zayin good, to think good and it will be good, the ability of our own optimistic expectations of the future to actually have impact on the way that future plays out. So I've known this idea since childhood about the power that we have on the future by really cultivating an optimistic perspective of trust. But when I started actually studying the letters, I saw in a few letters where the Rebbe points to very interesting sources that he has for this idea. One of them is a Talmud in Horiot, which is a little bit obscure tractate, where the Gemara discusses about if someone, before they travel out on sea, should look out for omens that it's a bad time to go or a good time to go. Of course, remember that at that time, traveling at sea was very dangerous and had high risk of never returning. And the Talmud discusses back and forth. And then one of the sages, I think the final ruling is, we don't know, even if these omens have nothing to them or have something to them or don't have, irrelevant of that conversation, a person should not look out for the omens because it may affect the actual result. Why? If he sees a certain omen that he thinks will have a negative effect on his trip, it means it's a bad time, even though that omen may have been meaningless. Because he thinks that it's going to be a bad time, that will actually impact the result. And that's where the danger lies. The danger was not because of the omen itself has any meaning, significance. It's because it put the person in a pessimistic mind space about this trip. And that is what actually has power on what the outcome will be. And I'm reading this, I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. It's an obscure line in an obscure tractate in the Talmud, and the Rebbe there sees a general lesson for how we should go about our ability to shape our own future and the power that our own thoughts and optimism has on that. And the Rebbe points also to a Zohar, where the Zohar explains that mystically, the higher world is mirrors the lower world, which is counterintuitive. Of course, we would think the other way around. And it says that when a person has joy, that actually has the power to influence joy and so to speak, broad spiritedness above, thereby impacting the actual result. And the Rebbe points to a teaching of the Maggid, of one of the early Hasidic masters, in another letter, that when we introduce thoughts or speech in our own world, we're actually bringing that into the cognitive space of the world, and that thereby makes it closer to actually happen. So if we're imagining positive situations, we're introducing that actual positive situation into reality, and thereby making it easier for it to come to fruition. And the same thing with negative pessimistic things. So this is an example of a longer endnote where I'm trying to articulate how the Rebbe takes these ideas that he keeps counseling to people. It's looking bad. it's so important for you to cultivate a stronger think good and it will be good perspective. But where is he taking that from? From a Talmud and Hariot, from a Zohar, somewhere in Bereshit, from a teaching of the Maggid in the 1700s. And that all is coming down to the modern experience about how we can face the angst that we have today. So that's one idea on the end.
Which is really where the Rebbe's teachings stand out among all recent scholars, but really historically in the Jewish community, where the Rebbe took the actual authentic teachings of the Talmud, of the Torah, of the Zohar, of Kabbalah, and showed how they're relevant. He didn't have to play games, God forbid. He literally, in front of our eyes, showed us the Talmud is talking to you, the Zohar is talking to you, whether it's your fear of travel or whether it's your concerns with your marriage or wherever it is. Every line of Torah can have applicable, relevant application, and that's where the Rebbe is talking to us. We have another question here from my friend Rob, who has a question about your research process. Would you say that with those many letters, tens of thousands, are each unique? And have you found some consistency and maybe a topic that took the Rebbe a long time to respond to that may be difficult or something that he needed to research? I guess the question is, most letters are standalone, but do you see patterns within the letters? Or maybe to expand the question a little bit more, are there periods, maybe decades, where the Rebbe addressed certain issues from one perspective, and then perhaps I started looking at it from a different perspective? And that's the beautiful thing about a live Q&A session, is that you're actually making the author think.
So the answer to the first half of the question is easy, about the patterns and the recurring themes. I think that goes back to what I spoke to about the general structure of the book. It's the second half that is challenging me, that I'm trying to think about in terms of an answer, if there are ideas that the Rebbe took time to, before responding to, if there are ideas. So to the first half of the question, yeah, again, I think that's the structure of the book, is that there are certain core principles that the Rebbe turns to in the Torah. He articulates it differently. He applies it differently to different people in different phases and different struggles. But the core theme of what it takes for us to build health carries through as a thread throughout the Rebbe's counseling. So absolutely, there are some of those recurring ideas, and that's what I tried to capture in the book. In terms of things that took the Rebbe time to research or to think about, it's a very interesting question. Honestly, I'll have to think about it. But one thing that does come to mind, that's actually a letter that I included in the book, is a letter to an older woman who lost her husband, who she was with for many years, and he died from a horrible illness, and they didn't have children together, leaving her entirely alone in the world after her husband died. And she wrote a letter to the Rebbe after she lost her husband. And the Rebbe begins his response by saying, I received your letter from a while ago about the passing of your husband. And I was waiting for the day of the passing of my father to respond to you. And Rebbe says, understandably, considering the gravitas, the weight of what you're talking about, of losing the closest person in your life and really having no substitute, so to speak. There's no children. There's just her alone. I waited until the Rebbe's words are the thoughts and the feelings, talking about himself, are more in the place to respond to such a setting. And that is the day after the yahrzeit of my own father, the Rebbe writes to her. So you do have times where, and then also in a case of grief, there is a terrible terrorist attack in 1955 in Kfar Chabad, in the little town that, or today much bigger, but that the Rebbe began, Friedrich Rebbe began as a place for Hasidic Jews. And 6-7 years after its founding, and these are people that went through Soviet Russia, they went through the Nazis, they finally coming to Israel to finally be able to feel safe. And two terrorists infiltrate and kill 5 of their young students. And it was a horrible, horrible tragedy. And right after the tragedy, the Rebbe didn't say anything. And the Rebbe, I see this in the letters of 1955 at the time. People write to the Rebbe, why aren't you saying something? And he responds to them. He says, a few days later, he does respond. But he says, I was emulating Aharon. After he lost his 2 children in the fire, Nadav and Avihu, he said, Vayudim Aaron. Aaron was silent. There's nothing to say that can address the tragedy at the moment of the tragedy. A few days later, so that's one area I could say where you see the Rebbe kind of maybe pausing before to let it sink, whether answering the widow or answering the tragedy in Chabad.
And of course, empathy was a big central theme in the Rebbe's letters, putting himself in the writer's shoes and trying to understand their perspective. Another question about your writing process, and this is about your original notebook. Did you categorize advice, or was it all in a flow? Did you originally break things down into categories, or did you have to go back to the notebooks afterwards and start figuring out what goes where?
No, I did begin with categorizing because I wanted, as I started seeing that there are tools emerging that the Rebbe explains in different ways, that was the starting point of my notebook. I said, I want to capture these tools as I'm seeing them emerging. And, once I have one general tool that I'm seeing, to capture new letters that I'm finding that are articulating this in a new way or in a, or the source of it. So yes, it was structured from the beginning.
It was structured. Speaking about grief and loss, what would the Rebbe say about self-forgiveness in that context as it relates to grief and the loss of a parent?
This is a question from
This is a live question that came in from
self-forgiveness. Can you explain how you understand that question?
So the way I understand the question is that obviously as adult children of our parents, eventually we become responsible for their care. And there's always going to be regrets once we lose a parent. I should have done more. I could have done more. I should have called them more often. I should have been around more often. I shouldn't have moved to the other side of the country. Just examples of where we start questioning our own actions, specifically in relation with our with loss and grief.
So I will say on the outset that thankfully I don't know this from the most personal place. Thank God my parents and siblings are all alive. So there are probably people that are more equipped at this. I could say that what you do see in the Rebbe's counseling around grief and in general is that the Rebbe saw it consistently as a remaining dynamic relationship between the family member and the departed loved one.
Meaning that it's not the end. Death is not the end.
It's still fluid. And the Rebbe writes about doing things that they loved, continuing their life in this world in the way that they need you. They need you to continue their impact on the world through you by acting on the areas that they were passionate about, by doing the caring to the people that they cared about. And in that way, you're not just doing something in their memory, they're actually living in you and through you and by your actions. And you do see an element of forgiveness where the Rebbe advises people to go to the gravesite and to commit to something, doing an action that they were passionate about, to continue their impact on the world, and that as a means of expressing your desire to make amends, even though they're not in this world anymore. So yes, I believe there is for sure an element of self-forgiveness, but I think it goes, actually, it's not just automatic. It actually comes together with making actual amends to continue the bond in a healthier way by acting on whatever they were passionate about in the world and asking forgiveness of them, as they listen to us when we speak to them.
Another question that came in online. In the Rebbe's view, as you understand it from your research, does he believe people can truly heal and change at their core, or is his guidance more about learning to make the best of one's circumstances? In other words, is change something that happens inside, or just the way we deal with the world around us?
I understood the question, I think, a little different. Can you read the question again?
Okay, sure. Does the Rebbe believe people can truly heal and change at their core, or is his guidance more about learning to make the best of one's circumstances?
I think I would say it depends. There's a difference, a very important distinction between external circumstances and internal circumstances, which means, does the Rebbe believe that people can heal at their core? An emphatic yes, really an emphatic yes. And I think that stands at the center of the Rebbe's counseling, is just an immense confidence and faith in the human being's ability to move from one place to an entirely different place. In fact, there's two lines that I found in the letter that just touched me, and I put in the book. The Rebbe writes to someone, he says, someone who has faith in the human being and in the soul that they have inside them also has faith that in a short period of time, a person can move from one place to an entirely different place, if they only believe in that, if they only put in the effort. So I think the Rebbe was an immense believer in our ability to heal at the core and to move to somewhere else entirely, sometimes even to the point of being very straightforward with people about their ability to transcend a place of pity, a place of victimhood, and to move to somewhere entirely different innerly. Now, when it comes to the circumstances, I think that's where the Rebbe also spoke about the ability to make peace with whatever the blessings Hashem gave us, and to focus on that instead of being focused on the negative.
Is there a teaching, which I guess is more of a general question, because the answer is obviously yes, but is there something specific that stands out as a recurring theme throughout all of the Rebbe's letters? In the words of Tatiana, who wrote this question, which teachings appear more often than anything else in the letters?
Really hard to choose one, but if I really had to choose one, I would say it's the fact that Hashgacha Pratit, that Hashem, that God doesn't just look at the world as a whole and history as a whole and humanity as a whole. He looks at every single one of us specifically, and he stands at our side. And therefore, we have a role and we have a purpose, and we're connected to others, and we're not walking this world alone. And that's a source of confidence. That's a source of meaning. That's a source of resilience. I think that would be the one idea that comes again and again and again and again. You're not alone. Hashem is with you. That's the center from which everything emerges.
And that's a great answer, because it's at the core of what Judaism represents. It's our belief in a relationship with God. And at the end of the day, everything happens for a reason. Marlene wants to know if the letters, and obviously I assume rather that we're referring to the actual original letters, if they're available online and searchable by topics. So the answer is, and this is not related to Letters for Life specifically, but the Rebbe's letters are available online, but most of them are in Yiddish and in Hebrew, so not always searchable for the regular casual reader. But over time, maybe more will be translated, and I'm sure there's going to be a volume 2 and 3 and 4 and so on of Letters for Life.
Yeah, I will mention, I think that Chabad.org actually has a beautiful archive of English letters online.
English letters, yeah.
That can be found on the Rebbe.org. So absolutely, some of them are categorized by topic as well. So check it out.
Matthew wants to know, was the Rebbe responding to unique people and issues, or using unique letters to dispense God's wisdom that he wanted to dispense and move the faith and Jewish nation forward? In other words, are they?
Can you read that again?
The question is, I think, are these form letters that the Rebbe had, canned letters that he would just send? Someone asks a question about marriage, he would send this letter. If someone asks a question about raising children, he would send that letter. Or are each of these letters that we're discussing and where the Rebbe advises people personally, is an actual personal advice to a unique individual?
Yes, obviously it's a letter to a unique individual. And you see this again and again about the differences between the letters and the different emphasis and the different actually practical advice. Sometimes the Rebbe says to pull back a little, sometimes the Rebbe says to lean in a little in terms of workload and so on. And there were certainly, when it came to bar mitzvahs, when it came to certain life cycle events, a standard template, I would say. Oftentimes there was a PS at the bottom of that, but if someone write in, hey, writing the Rebbe that they have a newborn child or they're having a bar mitzvah, there was a template the Rebbe would use in terms of the broader version, and then would often add things in his handwriting or as a PS.
All right, so Andy wants to know, so many of the lessons in the letters are universal, but some then end almost as a footnote with something very Jewish, such as, check that your mezuzah is kosher. Do you feel that words like that would turn off non-Jewish readers? Or more broadly, does the Rebbe's advice relate to everybody and not just Jews?
So I think I would use the phrase of the question that was asked, do you think this will turn off non-Jews? My experience was, over the past few months and in general, that not only does it not turn off non-Jews, what makes things interesting is actually the particulars of a specific counseling body, and it's not just saying it has a particular wellspring that it emerges from and a particular advice that it gives. And I think people can, take from that in their own life and interpret it in their own way for whatever is relevant to them in their specific, life. So I don't think it's a turnoff. I actually think that I probably should have done a little bit better, to be honest, in the book of explaining some of those terms, maybe better glossary. I did hear that from some non-Jewish people. But overall, the non-Jewish people have been especially enthusiastic about the Jewish ideas that have been.
You gave an example of the security guard who moonlighted as a pastor, or was it reversed?
Yeah. I'm not sure.
The next question comes all the way from France, from David in France, who wants to know, what is the Rebbe's answer and advice to effectively combat anti-Semitism? Coming from Europe and France, it's a very sensitive and subject close to many people's hearts.
So actually, just a few months ago, I was in South Africa, and when I was there, someone asked me, they said, they're experiencing, the Jewish community is feeling extremely hostile energy towards them. South Africa was the country that brought Israel to the international court. And what can we do? What can we do to fight this? What can we do to live with this based on your understanding of the Rebbe's counseling? So I said, what I studied is the Rebbe's advice for emotional health. So I think there's two parts of anti-Semitism and its effect on us. One part is fighting anti-Semitism, one part is how to make the anti-Semite less anti-Semitic. And the other part is curing and responding to the anti-Semite that lives in our head, the way the anti-Semite is affecting our emotional health. So I said the first point of how to make an anti-Semite less anti-Semitic is beyond my expertise, and I'll leave it to others. But the way to address the anti-Semites' effect on our emotional health, the way that after October 7th, Jews across the world have felt, targeted and gone after in a very personally unsettling way. That's actually something that I found in the letters, and it's included in chapter 5 in the book. Rebbe explains briefly that a minority is destined to develop an inferiority complex towards the majority. It is the natural course of events. And therefore, us Jews, more than ordinary human beings, have a desire to be accepted, have a desire to gain approval from the majority. And that's a natural outcome of us being a minority. And I think that's a big part of why after October 7th was so disorienting for Jews, was exactly the fact that after all that effort to be accepted, after all that effort to integrate, after all that effort to be like everyone else, they felt the sense, no, you're not one of us. You're actually this Jew, and you're a supporter of the worst elements in humanity. And that, in a way, was so disorienting. And the antidote to that the Rebbe counsels in the letters, for us to care a little bit less on what the anti-Semite says, for us to care a little bit less about what other people think about us, for us to care a little bit less about acceptance, is actually to reach deeper and connect with the roots of our own Jewish identity. Because once we're comfortable with our own identity as Jews and we feel connected to our people and the 3,000 years that we live together with the Torah and connection to Hashem, and we feel that in our skin, when you're comfortable in your own skin, you care a little bit less about what other people think about you. So counterintuitively, the antidote to that assault on our Jewish identity is actually to double down and reach deeper and become more comfortable in our Jewish identity on its own terms, beyond what our enemies say. And that will help cure the presence of the anti-Semite in our mind and its effect on our emotional health.
Okay. This is going to be a plug for the installments that many of our viewers and readers have been receiving in their email for the last month and a half, which includes a video of Rabbi Shmotkin explaining the topic in that specific installment with some text on Chabad.org's website. You get it in your email. In the first chapter of your book, and this is where this question is going, it's from Beverly. The first chapter of the book and in the first few installments of the Rebbe's private counsel, which is what the series is called on the website, they're in the general direction of reaching out to others and bringing joy to ourselves through helping other people, which was something that the Rebbe spoke about a lot. But what about introverts? Are we left out if forcing ourselves to be around and engage with others is difficult for us and sometimes causes us even more anxiety? In other words, if the Rebbe's advice is about just go out and be with other people and everything will be fine, what about us who would much rather just stay in our own rooms and not engage with others?
Or feel that it would cause anxiety, right? So I think as a general idea of in the Rebbe's counseling, the core health and healing comes from expanding our minds from just being absorbed in ourselves to seeing someone else's life and their experience. The way of how to help other people, the way how to be there for them. I think a lot of times people assume that means starting an organization. It means being some kind of loud person that's running everything, getting up there in the community center and running, a charity or a kitchen. I think when you see the letters, everyone, we have our own individual talents and our way of helping others. And I think in that way, introverts have something over the extroverts. And that is our introverts have an ability to listen and to be there for other people in a more sensitive way, in a more personable, intimate way. And nowhere does it say that the way to help others by making, massive things, or it's about getting out of our head for a little bit. And I'll add maybe that for introverts particularly, I think that may be even more important advice, because introverts tend to get in that loneliness of the recesses of their mind and become entangled with all sort of self-criticism and self-analysis. And the ability to see someone else's life and be there for them in an introverted way, in a way that's one-on-one, in a way that's listening, in a way that's more intimate and deep, that itself is the health and healing. It doesn't have to look like that grandiose extroverted type of way. In fact, I think there's something particular that introverts have and can give that maybe even puts them more than extroverts in certain settings and situations. So it's about expanding the mind and using whatever character we have to help others in their specific needs.
The next question shows us the wide range of readers that you have of the book and subscribers to the installments. In one of your recent installments and one in the beginning of the book, you mentioned the word, or you used the word Pnimiut, which is not very known, and what it means. I'm not sure. This writer who's from Paris, I don't know if she's awake now and watching, but if she is, maybe you can help her understand what this word Pnimiut means. That's used several times throughout a recent chapter in the private counsel series.
Yeah, so first of all, if I remember correctly, I'll just give the context of how it comes into the book. It's one of the few or only places that I go first-person narrative, and I share a personal story of what I learned from an elder Hasidic Jew about how to implement the idea that God is with you in your life. And one of the things he told us at that evening was that, money comes and goes, honor comes and goes, fame comes and goes. It all gets blown away by the wind. The only thing that stays with you for a lifetime is a little bit of Pnimiut. If you're able to attain a little Pnimiut, that will carry throughout your life. And this is coming from someone who is 92 years old. He was a survivor of the Holocaust.
So even if you stopped right there, I would know that Pnimiut is something special.
Yes. So I want to say that as a prelude to answering your question, because I think that helps understand why it's such a value on the one hand and why it's difficult to attain, but also can last through a lifetime. I would say it's one of the central values of Chabad Hasidism, and that is the idea to not just learn and not just know, but to make those teachings part of who we are, to the point of being inseparable. And I think specifically today in our world, where we're inundated with so much knowledge and so much information, the difference between what we just read, what we just encounter, to what becomes actually integrated into who we are, something we all appreciate and feel. The way to do that is obviously the big question, and that is something Hasidic masters and teachers try to take step by step their students into how to do that. I'll share a few things I think that are part of the process of making something Pnimiut, making something part of who you are. First of all, it's humility. And what that means is that so long as we're coming to the teachings with the sense that we have it figured out, and we know it all, we know basically things. I mean, we're coming to judge the content. We're coming with that distant, detached feeling, and we don't open our minds and open our hearts to actually receive something, to actually allow something to percolate in our minds, to percolate in our heart, to become part of who we are. Then we lose. That's the gateway to allow something to Pnimiut, a little humility, a little opening when you come to the content. Beyond that, in terms of a progression of actual things to do, first stage is thorough learning. You really need to understand the teaching and understand it in an intellectual way to master it, not just to go through it very fast, to really understand it. And then once the idea is understood, you try to reflect on it, try to meditate on it, and not just meditate on it in an abstract way, but to meditate on it in a way where you find yourself. What does this mean in my life? What does this mean to me as a person? How do I see myself in this idea from Jewish mysticism, from the Hasidic masters, from the Torah, from whatever it is that you're studying? And when we do that, that's where we begin the process of Pnimiut. That's where we begin crossing the bridge between distant information to united wisdom with who we are. And it's a lifetime process. But once we have something small that becomes part of who we are, that's what I think that other Chassid was trying to teach me and my friends. You have that now forever. No one can steal that. No circumstance, no war, no upheaval. This is part of your very character of who you are in this world. And that's what I think is so special about the letters, is that they are part of that bridge where you take these abstract ideas, and the Rebbe begins the process of allowing us to make that part of our living, part of our perspective, part of our feelings, part of our actual day in, day out life, if we only open our hearts to it. So that's a short explanation of Pnimiut.
Make it real, make it who you are, make it part of your life. So when we started about an hour and 3 minutes ago, we said that this program is going to last an hour, and that's we didn't know how many viewers we'd have. We didn't know how many questions we'd be getting. So if you're okay with sticking around for a little longer and answering a few more questions, we're not going to shut this down after an hour. You're cool with that?
Sure.
All right. So this is something that we actually kind of touched on earlier, but it phrases it a little bit differently. A question from Arnold: how did the Rebbe view and treat people who are not Chabad, not Hasidic, not Orthodox, and maybe not even Jewish? And if I may, just some commentary on the question, or at least the way you'll frame the answer. It's not so much did the Rebbe treat them as equals, because every human being is an equal, every human being is deserving of the Rebbe's time, but did the Rebbe address people differently based on their background and where they're coming from?
So, interestingly enough, I was reading an introduction by Rabbi Nissim Mendel, who was very involved in the Rebbe Secretariat and in the correspondence the Rebbe was having people across the world. He wrote a little bit about the order of events, how things happen. And one of the things he wrote, which struck me, was that from his observations, the Rebbe would respond first to someone who had less of a background before someone had more of a background. And the reason, I don't remember if this was his own interpretation or something he heard from the Rebbe, was that the person with more of the background would understand the type of mail the Rebbe is getting, the type of things that the Rebbe is working on, and they would have more of an understanding that if it takes 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month to get a letter, that's only understandable. But the other person would immediately start taking it personal. This is a personal rejection. This is a personal being ignored. So in a way, there was a preference, not preference, but I would say in terms of response time, sometimes the people with less background would receive, whether that means they weren't Jewish. Actually, I think he clearly writes that non-Jewish people would receive letters maybe before Jewish people. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is interesting to note, and I think this is, it talks a lot of the Rebbe's perspective, that in letters to people who did have a background of a rabbinic background, or a background of communal activism, or a background of whatever lineage, today, and this is why it struck me so much, the Rebbe leans in, and the Rebbe does speak about it to them. But the way he speaks about it to them is not as a way to flatter them, but actually as a calling on them. It says, you have so much, we carry the accomplishments of our grandparents, we carry the accomplishments of the people we descend from, and that gives us power to actually build on that and take that further. So the Rebbe tells him, your grandfather was your grandmother. They're living in you. They're living through you. It is upon you to continue their work on a whole new level. So he does lean in sometimes when there is a background to talk to. So it's very interesting to study. This is just a few points on that. There's obviously more to consider in those patterns. That wasn't the angle I was coming at so much. So there's probably people that are more equipped to answer that. But yeah.
Okay. Did you find a theme where the Rebbe addresses the impact of a person's emotional struggle with their relationship with God?
Again?
A person's emotional struggle being tied to their relationship with God, which I guess in layman's terms is, did the Rebbe ever address people blaming religion on their mental issues? Or vice versa, rather, blaming their emotional or mental issues on perhaps too much religion or too strong of a relationship with God? Or did the Rebbe specifically tell people, have a stronger relationship with God and that'll resolve your emotional issues? All right, if you want to
I think there's two sides to that question, and it does take more time to think about and answer that thoughtfully. But I'll mention 2 points that I think I can say, and that is in terms of, if religion mixed with people's mental health struggles. I actually just heard of a response. I heard this from the first person who received this. Her husband was struggling with mental health challenges. and he was refusing, or he just wasn't taking his medication. And he was a religious Jew. And the Rebbe wrote to the wife who reached out to the Rebbe to tell her husband that there's a commandment in the Torah to listen to the doctor. And that is a command of Hashem. Hashem says, Rapo Yirape, the doctor has the ability to heal, to know what we need. So he says, so their handwritten note, if your husband says that he doesn't have any problems and therefore he doesn't need medication, you should tell her that nevertheless Hashem's command persists to listen to the doctor's advice and to take his word for what he says is necessary for your health and for the husband's health and healing. And why am I mentioning this is because I do think that in times when people were entangled, the Rebbe sometimes tried to reason with them from their religious entanglement and to bring them back to the doctor from that, because going head on with people in those situations sometimes actually backfires, because you say, well, there's no understanding. I'm religious and you're not. So that's why you don't care. To explain to them there's a commandment in the Torah, Arapo Yirape, that the doctor has the power to heal. And from that, to bring the person back to the doctor and to take the medication, I thought was very striking. And then on the other side, about Hashem being part of the healing. So again, you have the Rebbe always emphasizing the importance of listening to the doctor, the medication, and that part of things. But yes, the spiritual life of a person, the Rebbe saw as 100% part of the holistic human being that we are, and therefore relationship to Hashem, spirituality, God, are absolutely part of also what builds our emotional health.
So not as contradictions, but they have to work together hand in hand.
Correct.
The next comment is a comment and a question, really. A huge fan of your book. Has been very meaningful to me. In order to truly open oneself to the wisdom in Letters for Life and find personal enlightenment from it, here's where the question starts. What mindset or approach do you think is most helpful when reading it? Or let's rephrase that question. Is it a coffee table book that you open it up and read a chapter here, a chapter there? Is it something that you recommend reading in order, chapter by chapter, and taking notes, making comments throughout the margins? How would you suggest using the book as an actual guide for life?
So I think if I would go back to the words, what was the question? What mindset and
what
words?
What mindset or approach do you think is most helpful when reading it?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to our question about Pnimiut and the importance of humility when approaching the Rebbe's letters and the Torah that it's coming off and coming from. I think coming with an open heart and trying to allow the Rebbe's words to come off the page and talk to you is what makes all the difference in terms of their ability to touch us and to bring us somewhere else. So I think working before we say, allow those words to enter, those words from the Rebbe's letters to come in and to talk to you.
Be willing to receive and to digest what's being given you. Parrots wants to know if you're going to be publishing an audiobook.
Oh, yeah, I get that question a lot. Actually, it's in the discussions. I can't say we began recording yet, but we are hoping to begin very soon. So yes, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Many others are with that.
One more question specifically about emotional health, and that's that we talk about conquering our fears. We talk about being cognizant of things that we could do, things that we can't do, and overcoming our fears. Is there ever a time where fear is considered a positive?
How would you define fear?
So if you define fear as being something like pain, which is an indication that there is something amiss, something needs to be dealt with, something needs to be handled. If you don't feel pain, then you don't know that there's something wrong and you won't get it treated. And fear is a human emotion that is supposed to help us put our guard up so that you need to avoid certain situations. So I guess from the perspective of the Rebbe's letters, where yes, you have to overcome fears, but at what point do you say that a fear is actually something that is positive that could perhaps help you avoid certain situations?
I don't think I saw a clear letter on this subject, or at least doesn't come to mind at this moment. I think going back to the letter about the flying and the fear of flying, and then making peace with the fear as not being the destruction of her life, but actually, something that's possible to live with, as helping to overcome the entanglement with it. I think maybe that's something that's relevant to this question, in the sense that understanding why we have fear and seeing it not as an enemy, but actually as something that's part of it, can help us overcome our entanglement with the fear, our being upset at ourselves. Oh my gosh, why am I so scared? I'm such a bad person. I'm such a weak person. To understand why we have that and the net positive that it contributes can help us from becoming entangled and self-critical about it, which in the Rebbe's conception, this I can say with confidence, is part of what helps us heal from the fear. So I can't say specifically to the way you're saying, but the general spirit of not becoming fearful about the fear or angst about the angst is certainly something across the board.
Right. Okay. I think we're gonna close up shop now and call it a day. But before we do, any closing remarks that you'd like to share with our audience?
It's funny. I was a few days ago. I was in another podcast, virtual conversation. Someone asked me the same thing, and I was like I didn't, I was thinking, and I think this is the energy of the Rebbe's counseling in general. So I'm going to say the thought that came to me at the time, and that is that we're much bigger than we think we are, both as individuals and as a people. And we owe it to ourselves to allow that greatness to shine. And I think that that's the spirit of the Rebbe's counseling across the board.
Wow, that's amazing. So on a personal level, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for helping perpetuate the Rebbe's teachings and to bring it down to earth to as wide an audience as possible. Thank you for taking time and speaking with us today, answering the many questions that came through. And again, as a plug to the Rebbe's Private Counsel series on Chabad.org, sign up. You'll get a weekly email with an excerpt from the book, along with a video introducing that chapter. And you too can live with the Rebbe's guidance and the Rebbe's advice in your life. And I'll tell Rabbi Shmotkin that we're looking forward to future volumes and future installments. And may we all merit to one day be reunited with our Rebbe and learn directly from the Rebbe in the most practical and relevant ways possible.
Thank you.